After more than a decade, it finally happened. The mighty Bayern Munich finally lost their grip on the German Bundesliga. And the one to bring them down is none other than ex-player Xabi Alonso. Wielding the slingshot known as Leverkusen, he managed to bring down the Goliath that is the Rekordmeister, simultaneously ending Bayern's 11-year-long title streak and even more impressively ending the Neverkusen curse once and for all. As if that wasn't impressive enough, he also won the DFB Pokal. And craziest of all, he did it while not losing a single game. Let me repeat that. Leverkusen managed to play 52 games while not losing even once, becoming the first team in the history of football to win the Bundesliga, completely unbeaten. This is the story of how the team famously known as Neverkusen came back from the trenches of the relegation zone and was reborn as the unbeatable Neverlusen. Before getting into current-day Leverkusen, I'd like to give a brief rundown of their history, just so we're all on the same page about where they came from and how they became kind of a joke in German football. If you don't really care, feel free to skip to this timestamp to get to the recent events, although I highly recommend watching it so you fully understand the impact of what they achieved. Their origins aren't exactly what you would expect from a football team. It all started with a letter to the board of directors of the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in 1903. In it, 2 employees asked for support to establish a new gymnastic club in Wiesdorf. Their goal was to make gymnastics more socially acceptable and accessible to men. Unfortunately, most men weren't attracted to the idea of gymnastics as it was very drill-like and militaristic. This led to about 16 men breaking away from the gymnastics club in order to establish their own football team. And so, the first version of Leverkusen was born on the 1st of June 1907. They played in a black kit with red colors, not too dissimilar from the shirts they use today. During the 1920s, while they were playing in the 9th division in Cologne, another group of people broke away from the current team and they established their own team, Football Club 04 Leverkusen. They did this because they wanted a more competitive environment with other teams, while the old team wanted to return to their roots in swimming, fencing and other sports, without including games from abroad such as football. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, they slowly but surely improved and climbed their way up all the way to the first division of the Cologne District League. In 1936, sporting the more recognizable Bayer Crossbatch, they reached the second tier of German football for the first time in their history. During the 1950s, they finally earned promotion to the Oberliga West, after finishing as runners-up in the tier below multiple times during the 1940s. The Oberliga gave them a chance to play against some massive German clubs, like Schalke 04, Rot-Weiss Essen and Borussia Dortmund. During the 1954-1955 season, they even finished third in the league, missing out on the finals tournament with just 3 points. Unfortunately, the following season would see them drop back to the second tier after a terrible season. The following decades proved pretty uneventful, as Leverkusen would struggle to keep their place in professional football. Luckily, in 1979, their decades-long struggle finally came to an end. They played their second-place rivals Bayern 05 Wielding in one of the final match days of the season, and came back from a 3-goal deficit to see promotion to the Bundesliga, for the first time in their history. Despite having to either battle relegation or floating in the middle of the table for most seasons, Bayer Leverkusen managed to stay in the German First Division. During the 1987-1988 season, they even managed to win one of their biggest trophies to date, the Europa League. They beat teams like Feyenoord and Barcelona in order to reach the final against Espanyol. They again came back from a 3-goal deficit and won on penalties. Besides this trophy, they never really won much, with a cup win in 1993 being the exception. From the late 1990s onwards, they finished as runners-up in the Bundesliga a staggering 5 times. This includes one time where they choked a 6-point lead in the last 3 games. They even reached the finals of the Champions League that same year, but lost 2-1 against Real Madrid after that iconic Zidane volley. This brings us to today. It's easy to say why they get called Neverkusen. They only won 2 top-flight trophies in over a century of the club's existence. And to make matters worse, they often finished as runners-up, adding that extra layer of pain. They always seemed to lack that last bit of magic that could have secured them some very important titles. During the 2022-2023 season, they were even struggling to stay in the Bundesliga at all, having their worst start to a Bundesliga campaign since 1979, earning only 5 points out of a possible 24. But their entire history would drastically change during October of that season. Because of the dramatic start, they sacked their manager and appointed Xabi Alonso. Of course, everyone knows about his accolades as a player, having won the Champions League with both Real Madrid and Liverpool, plus multiple league titles and of course the World Cup with that insane Spain team in 2010. Needless to say, he's a legend of the game. However, when it comes to experience as a manager, he didn't really do much yet, as he only earned his UEFA Elite coaching license in 2018, alongside fellow legends Xavi and Raúl. He started as a youth coach for Madrid, but quickly moved over to Real Sociedad's B team. They were playing in the Spanish 3rd division, and he managed to promote them to the 2nd division in his 2nd season at the club. This is pretty noteworthy, as Real Sociedad's B team didn't play in the Segunda Division since 1979. His lack of experience with managing a top club didn't deter Leverkusen, however, and when moving to Leverkusen in October October of 2022, he made an instant impact with a 4-0 win over Schalke. He even led them to the semi-finals of the Europa League, but unfortunately lost 1-0 against Mourinho's Roma. Despite his loss, they stayed consistent in the league, ultimately earning them a solid 6th place finish and guaranteeing European football. They weren't the powerhouse they would become the following season quite yet, but they showed great promise and above all, a fearless mentality against the likes of Bayern and Leipzig. When the next season rolled around, Leverkusen saw the potential their side had with Alonso at the helm and extended him until 2026. Securing Xabi was just one part of the puzzle, and they needed a stronger squad if they wanted to go for a proper title charge. It should be mentioned that they aren't exactly a poor team. They are backed by the Bayer pharmaceutical company after all, putting them in the naughty corner of German football. However, they weren't operating at a crazy loss either, with players like Havertz and Son leaving for a good amount of money. This particular season, they earned about 70 million in player sales, with most of that coming from Moussas Diaby moved to Aston Villa. They used these funds to buy key players in every position. Up top, they went with Victor Oko Boniface, one of the most promising players from the Belgian Pro League. Next up was their midfield, where they opted for Arsenal player Granit Xhaka. Xhaka had been playing in Arsenal starting 11 for years, but fans didn't fully believe in him and some even saw him as a liability. Despite this, Leverkusen paid 25 million for the Swiss international. On top of Xhaka, they also bought Borussia Mönchengladbach's Jonas Hofmann, another player that had been amazing for years, but was, at least in my opinion, very underrated. For even more midfield and attacking depth, they also bought Nathan Tella from Southampton, who often competed with the aforementioned Hofmann for a starting spot. Next, they bolstered their defense with Spanish left-back Grimaldo, a key player for Benfica that was very much an upgrade on Sinkgraven and Bakker. Lastly, they managed to agree on a surprising loan deal with Bayern Munich for Croatian talent Stanisic. This was a very questionable move on Bayern's part, and it would come to haunt them in the future. Don't be mistaken though, their new arrivals weren't the only cards up their sleeve. They already had a very promising young squad, with players like Hincapié, Frimpong, and last but not least, Florian Wirtz, the latter being the crowning jewel that deserves to be in the same bracket of talents as Musiala and Bellingham. Although having a young talented squad is nice, you still need some experience in your team for when the going gets tough. This experience came in the form of Jonathan Tah, Radetzky, Robert Andrich, and even new signings Hofmann and Xhaka. With the squad itself out of the way, let's take a look at how they actually lined up on the pitch. Xabi Alonso preferred a 3-4-3 formation with an emphasis on passing and counter-attacking football. Radetzky was Leverkusen's first choice goalkeeper and captain. In front of him were Tapsoba, Tah and Hincapié defending the goal, although both Kosunu and Stanisic would get rotated in very often as well. This meant that Alonso basically had 5 top players he could use as a defensive line, making it difficult for the opponent to predict how to approach offensively. Midfield-wise, they preferred to play Frimpong and Grimaldo on the right and left respectively. However, both Stanisic and Hincapié could also fill these roles when needed. The central midfield roles were occupied by Xhaka and Andrich, with Palacios also rotating in fairly often. Lastly, the attack. Wirtz of course being the main event, but co-stars Boniface and Hofmann definitely pulled their weight too. Tella, Schick and Iglesias could also slot in nicely in the event of an injury or other, as was the case when Boniface suffered a groin injury when training with his national team for AFCON. As you can see, Leverkusen really built themselves an insanely deep squad, with a very strong bench and players that could play a bunch of different positions, making for a formidable team that was ready to take the footballing world by storm. The tactics on the pitch weren't the team's only strength though. Xabi is a real people manager as well. As stated by multiple players such as Frimpong, they really enjoyed playing under him. He knows exactly what the strengths and weaknesses of each of his players are, meaning he knows exactly which players to use and when, even in very dire situations. On top of this, he also allowed players their own freedom. The perfect example being Grimaldo and Frimpong, who were allowed to get forward a lot and showcase their attacking abilities. Next, he always remained calm, even when they were down at halftime. This carried over to the team, who in turn were also able to remain calm on the pitch, often bringing them the victory in the end. Finally, he's a manager that actively participates in the training sessions himself, showing players how certain moves are supposed to be performed. At 42 years young, he's still more than fit enough to show the insane technique he possesses. It commands a certain level of respect and appreciation that leads to an overall more positive training and dressing room atmosphere. Okay, now that we know the club, coach, players and how they lined up, let's finally talk about the record-breaking season that put them in the world's history books. Interestingly, they lost their first 2 pre-season friendlies, a stark contrast to how the rest of their season would go. Their first competitive match of the season was a difficult one right out of the gate, a home game against Leipzig, a team that wanted to compete for the title just as much as themselves. As expected, the game was very close, with the end score being 3-2 in favor of Leverkusen after goals from Frimpong, Tah and Florian Wirtz. A real statement victory that proved that they had what it takes to compete with the best teams in the league. Their next 2 games against Mönchengladbach and Darmstadt made for fairly routine victories. The 4th game was probably the biggest test of the whole season. They faced Bayern Munich in the Allianz Arena, who, as most of you know, won the Bundesliga the previous 11 seasons, meaning they were the obvious favourites to win it a 12th time. If there was ever a time to prove themselves, even more so than against Leipzig, it was now. They started in one of the worst ways possible, with Kane already scoring a header for Bayern in the 7th minute. Despite this early setback, they kept their heads in the game and Grimaldo equalized with an amazing free kick. The rest of the game would be in Bayern's favour, and Goretzka scored the equalizer in the 86th minute. Their hope of getting any points out of the game were seemingly over. However, just in the nick of stoppage time, Davies fought Hofmann in the box and the VAR pointed to the spot for a penalty. It was pretty soft, but a penalty nonetheless. Palacios converted the spot kick and so Leverkusen could go home with a point. These last minute winners would become a pattern in a lot of their games, as we'll see in the future. Their next 8 games proved to be less of a challenge. They won all of them, scoring an insane 24 goals while only conceding 5 times. Bayern dropped some points against Leipzig in that same period, meaning Leverkusen were now 2 points clear at the top. Just before the game, they had 2 very difficult games. A home game against Borussia Dortmund and an away game against Stuttgart. The latter was another very surprising player in the Bundesliga race. They barely managed to hold on the previous season and even had to play in the relegation playoffs against Hamburg. As a result, it was really unexpected to see them anywhere near the top of the Bundesliga table at the halfway point. Their striker Guirassy was even able to score at the same rate as Harry Kane. Nevertheless, Leverkusen managed to get 2 1-1 draws despite having gone behind in both games. At the same time, Bayern once again dropped points in a humiliating 5-1 defeat away against Frankfurt. This meant that Leverkusen were still safe at the top of the table, going into the winter break, albeit with an insanely close 1-point lead. After a refreshing break, both title contenders were able to take on the Rekordmeister, or that was the plan at least. But Bayern already dropped 3 points in a home game against Werder Bremen, while Leverkusen remained undefeated. They just kept coming closer and closer to their first ever title. The last roadblock they had to face was the return fixture at home to Bayern. This game would most likely seal the fate of both teams. Winning meant Leverkusen would go 5 points clear at the top, which would most likely result in the Meisterschale, given the form they were in. Regardless of the pressure they must have felt, they didn't disappoint. Bayern loanee Stanisic opened the scoring, once again showing they might have been better off if they kept him. They kept pushing and outplayed Bayern for the majority of the game, resulting in a 3-0 scoreline. After this game, Bayern kind of collapsed and dropped a total of 10 points. They even lost 3-2 to Bochum, the club that helped them so much the year before. Meanwhile, Leverkusen just kept on winning, and the lead grew to over 10 points, virtually making Leverkusen the new Bundesliga champions. Not even the powers of Dortmund and Arsenal combined could bottle this lead. However, they had to wait until matchday 29 to officially be named the new Bundesliga champions. They faced Werder Bremen at home and comfortably beat them 5-0, with Wirtz even scoring the first hat-trick of his career. A really poetic ending to a title race that not only ended Bayern's grip on the league, but more importantly resulted in Leverkusen lifting their first ever Bundesliga title. Their fans were unable to contain their excitement and stormed the pitch before the final whistle. But despite them having won the league, the battle was far from over. They were still unbeaten in all 3 competitions they were in: the Bundesliga, DFB Pokal and Europa League. They could not only change their own history, but perhaps even the history of both German and world football. On top of walking the path of Arsenal's Invincibles, exactly 20 years later, they also had the chance to become the first ever team to win a treble, completely unbeaten. Now, we've talked enough about what they did in the league. Let's shift our focus to the 2 remaining tournaments they were still in: the Pokal and Europa League. Let's start with the former. To be honest, their Pokal run wasn't all that exciting. They faced lower league teams in 5 of their 6 rounds, which they mostly made easy pickings of. The only team they struggled against was Stuttgart, who put up a really good fight, but ultimately couldn't stop the Leverkusen Black Magic and conceded a 90th minute corner from Jonathan Tah. In the final, they faced second-tier Kaiserslautern, a team battling relegation. Despite this, they put up a decent fight, but were unable to stop Leverkusen as Xhaka fired a beautiful long shot into the top corner, once again proving his worth. They were now able to celebrate their 2nd trophy of the season. Unfortunately, this was a bittersweet victory because of what happened 1 week prior in the Europa League. Their run in the Europa League was a little more difficult, although their group stage opponents weren't too hard. They made quick work of Hecken, Molde and Karabach, scoring an insane 19 goals while only conceding 3. They did, however, need a stoppage time goal from Boniface to win their away game against Karabach, the first of many. In the round of 16, they actually drew Karabach again. At first, I thought the scriptwriters messed up or something, but after the results, I gotta admit they were cooking something. In the first leg, Leverkusen actually went behind 2-0 at halftime, and they seemed to be in for a rough ride. However, Wirtz scored in the 70th minute and gave them newfound hope, though this didn't make things easier. Their opponents defended really well and seemed to be the team to give Leverkusen their first loss of the season. But just as they were staring defeat in the eyes, the inevitable stoppage time equalizer was scored courtesy of a Patrick Schick header. The second leg was even more insane. They were once again 2-1 behind when stoppage time rolled around. But the football gods smiled even more favorably upon Leverkusen that evening. Not only did Schick score the equalizer equalizer again in the 93rd minute, he scored a second time in the 98th minute, ultimately winning them the game with a 5-4 aggregate score. Next up were the quarterfinals, in which they faced West Ham United. They dominated the first leg, getting an insane 13 shots on target, while the English club only managed to get one. Both Hofmann and Boniface scored, with the latter once again finding the net in stoppage time, though admittedly it wasn't an equalizer or winner this time. West Ham found their footing again in the second leg, but it wasn't enough to beat Leverkusen and the game ended 1-1. On to the semi-finals against Rome, the team that knocked them out of the competition a year prior. The match started off fairly evenly, but Karsdorp quickly made a huge mistake and Wirtz didn't waste the easy tap-in. After that point, the game was heavily in favor of Leverkusen, and Andrich scored a banger from outside the box to seal Roma's fate. The second leg was another classic Leverkusen witchcraft moment. They conceded 2 penalties, both of which were scored by Paredes in the 43rd and 66th minute, placing the game at an aggregate draw. As is tradition at this point, Leverkusen first scored in the 82nd minute, courtesy of a Mancini own goal, and of course, you can't forget the late equalizer, with Stanisic scoring in the 97th minute. This is like his third stoppage time goal, by the way, ultimately saving Leverkusen's unbeaten streak once again. All that was left was the final, in which they faced Atalanta. Even though they beat favourites Liverpool, the odds were still in favour of the seemingly unstoppable Leverkusen train. Unfortunately, this train's final stop would be right there in Dublin. In a moment of distraction, Palacios lost sight of Lookman, leading to an early goal for Atalanta. Not even 15 minutes later, the Nigerian scored again, this time with a beautiful shot from outside the box. And so, Leverkusen had to go into the halftime break with a 2-goal disadvantage. I'm sure most people didn't worry too much for Leverkusen. The stoppage time hadn't started after all. All they needed was just a little more time, right? Sadly for them, Lookman completed his hat-trick in the 75th minute with another beautiful shot. And so, as with all good things, their unbeaten streak came to an end against Gasperini's Atalanta. This was probably their worst performance of the season. Not only because it was the first match they lost in the entire season, but also because it was the first time since January they failed to score a goal. Despite all the effort and late goals that led up to the final, they failed to win. However, that doesn't mean they didn't go down in history. After all those weekday struggles in the Pokal and Europa League, we can't forget about probably their toughest mission, bringing home the Invincible Bundesliga title. They still had some tough games coming up, including the return fixtures against Dortmund and Stuttgart. They really turned Real Madrid's trademark late comebacks up to like 100, scoring in the 97th and 96th minutes respectively, scraping a draw together in both games. You're probably thinking I'm making all this up for dramatic effects, but they really just kept on scoring these super late goals. I've never seen anything like this. How they kept getting away with this is beyond me. The last 3 games of the Bundesliga season were against Frankfurt, Bochum and Augsburg. They didn't have any mercy whatsoever and destroyed all 3 teams. Finally, the wait was over. They achieved something not even Bayern has ever achieved, a truly historic Invincible season. The celebrations were rightfully insane. After all, they worked their asses off for an entire season, always having to stay focused. There was always something to play for, either the trophies themselves or the legendary Invincible status. Despite their failure to win the treble, the insanity of their achievement cannot be understated. It will take a very, very long time to be beaten. The final question that I want to answer is, what does this all mean for the future of football? Obviously, there is a Champions League next year, which I'm personally very excited for. Not only is the whole tournament format different, but now Leverkusen is a part of it. They more than proved that they have the squad for it, and I'm curious to see what they will achieve. They didn't lose any of their important players and even strengthened their squad further, so I fully expect them to be out in full force. Besides that, their Bundesliga title will most likely improve the quality of the entire league. They proved to other teams in the league that Bayern is in fact beatable. They showed that even the strongest opponent has their weak points. I hope this motivates other teams to compete for the title as well in the coming years. An overall more competitive environment also brings more new fans to the league, lifting the entire league and perhaps even freeing them from the Farmers League allegations. This is all to say there are some very exciting times ahead for German football, both domestically and in Europe. With the Bundesliga having started up again recently, I recommend you all to give it a shot this season. It just might surprise you. That wraps things up for our look into Leverkusen's 2023-2024 season. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. I'm planning on making a lot more stuff like this. With that out of the way, have a beautiful day.